Shopkeeper denies service to a poor veteran, regrets it after his identity is revealed. Maple Grove was a town that seemed to exist in a perpetual state of autumn, even when the calendar insisted otherwise. Crimson and gold leaves clung to ancient oaks lining Main Street, their branches reaching out like gnarled fingers over the quaint storefronts below. At the heart of this picturesque scene stood Susan's General Store, a fixture in the community for over 3 decades. Susan McDonald, a woman in her late 50s with salt and pepper hair always neatly pinned back, took immense pride in her establishment. The store was more than just a business. It was the lifeblood of Maple Grove, a place where gossip flowed as freely as the coffee from the ancient percolator that sat on a corner of the counter. The aroma of freshly ground beans mingled with the scent of polished wood and new leather, creating an atmosphere that was both comforting and inviting. On this particular morning, Susan stood behind the counter, her keen eyes surveying the familiar faces that milled about her domain. Mrs. Peterson was examining the canned goods, no doubt planning her famous chili for the upcoming Harvest Festival. Old Mr. Johnson was perusing the newspaper rack, his gnarled hands flipping through pages with practiced ease. Everything was as it should be, a perfectly orchestrated symphony of small-town life, but Susan's contentment was short-lived. The bell above the door chimed, announcing a new arrival, and the shopkeeper's eyes narrowed as she took in the sight of the stranger who had just entered her store. He was an older man, perhaps in his 60s, with a face etched by time and hardship. His coat, once a robust navy blue, had faded to a nondescript gray, frayed at the edges and hanging loosely on his thin frame. Scuffed boots, caked with mud, left faint imprints on the meticulously polished floor. Susan's lips pursed into a thin line as she watched the man make his way down the first aisle. His movements were slow, deliberate, as if each step required great effort. To Susan's critical eye, he looked like trouble, the kind of drifter that occasionally passed through Maple Grove, disrupting the town's carefully maintained order. As the stranger examined a can of beans, turning it over in his weathered hands, Susan felt a familiar tightening in her chest. It was the same feeling she'd experienced years ago when a group of traveling salesmen had tried to set up shop in town, selling shoddy goods at inflated prices. She'd been instrumental in running them out, protecting her neighbors from what she saw as predatory outsiders. Now, watching this shabby newcomer browse her shelves, Susan couldn't shake the sense that history was repeating itself. She'd worked too hard, sacrificed too much, to let someone like this tarnish the reputation of her store or her town. The other customers had noticed the newcomer as well. Mrs. Peterson had abandoned her examination of canned goods, her eyes darting nervously between the stranger and Susan. Mr. Johnson peered over the top of his newspaper, his bushy eyebrows furrowed in concern. The atmosphere in the store had shifted, tension replacing the usual comfortable buzz of conversation. Susan's mind raced, conjuring up scenarios of shoplifting or worse. She'd heard stories from neighboring towns about drifters causing trouble, and she was determined not to let that happen here. Not in her store. Not in Maple Grove. As the man made his way towards the bread aisle, Susan stepped out from behind the counter. She moved casually, pretending to straighten items on nearby shelves, all the while keeping a watchful eye on the stranger. She noticed his hands, calloused and scarred, as he reached for a loaf of day-old bread. Those weren't the hands of an honest working man, she thought. They were the hands of someone who'd lived a hard life, maybe even a criminal life. The stranger seemed oblivious to the scrutiny he was under. He moved to the coffee section, his eyes lighting up at the sight of the various blends on offer. For a moment, a small smile played across his lips, softening the hard lines of his face. But Susan didn't see the smile. She only saw the threat, the potential for disorder in her carefully managed world. As the man approached the counter, his arms cradling a modest selection of items, Susan steeled herself for the confrontation to come. She'd dealt with his kind before, she told herself. She knew how to handle this situation. But as she looked into the stranger's eyes, preparing to deliver the speech she'd already formulated in her mind, Susan hesitated. For just a moment, she saw something there. A glimmer of dignity, of quiet strength that seemed at odds with his ragged appearance. It was gone in an instant, replaced by a look of weariness that seemed to age him even further. The man placed his items on the counter: a can of beans, a loaf of bread, a small packet of coffee. Simple staples, the kind of things anyone might buy. But to Susan, they represented something more. They were a challenge to the order she'd worked so hard to maintain, a threat to the community she'd sworn to protect. As the stranger reached into his pocket, presumably for money to pay for his goods, Susan made her decision. She'd built this store from nothing, turned it into the heart of Maple Grove. She wasn't about to let anyone, especially not some bedraggled drifter, jeopardize that. Taking a deep breath, Susan prepared to speak, unaware that her words were about to set in motion a chain of events that would shake the foundations of her world and force her to confront truths about herself and her community that she'd long ignored. The autumn sun streamed through the windows, casting long shadows across the store. Outside, leaves rustled in the breeze, a gentle soundtrack to the drama unfolding within. Maple Grove had always prided itself on being a close-knit, caring community. But as Susan opened her mouth, ready to turn away a man in need based solely on his appearance, that image was about to be severely tested. The clock on the wall ticked steadily, each second punctuating the tense silence that had fallen over Susan's general store. The stranger stood at the counter, his weathered hands resting lightly on the modest pile of groceries he'd selected. His eyes, a deep blue that spoke of distant horizons and unspoken stories, met Susan's gaze with a quiet dignity that seemed at odds with his shabby appearance. Susan's fingers tightened on the edge of the counter, her knuckles whitening as she steeled herself for what she was about to do. The words she'd rehearsed in her mind now seemed to stick in her throat, but she forced them out, her voice cutting through the hushed atmosphere of the store like a knife. "I'm sorry?" she began, her tone crisp and cold. "Oh, but we don't serve people like you here." The words hung in the air, heavy and irrevocable. The stranger's eyebrows knitted together in confusion, a flicker of hurt passing across his face before being quickly masked by a carefully neutral expression. "I don't understand," he said, his voice low and gravelly, as if it hadn't been used much lately. "What do you mean by people like me?" Susan's chin lifted slightly, a defensive gesture that spoke volumes about her state of mind. She was committed now, determined to see this through. In her mind, she was protecting her store, her customers, her town from a perceived threat. "I think you know exactly what I mean," she replied, her words clipped and precise. "This is a respectable establishment. We have standards to maintain, and frankly, you don't meet those standards." The stranger's eyes widened slightly, understanding dawning in their depths. He glanced down at his worn clothing, then back at Susan, a mixture of disbelief and sadness etching lines around his mouth. "Ma'am," he began, his tone respectful despite the hostile reception. "I'm just trying to buy some food. I have money." He reached into his pocket, pulling out a handful of crumpled bills. The sight of the money only seemed to harden Susan's resolve. "It's not about the money," she said, her voice rising slightly. "It's about maintaining a certain atmosphere in my store. My customers expect a certain level of decorum, and you, sir, are disrupting that." As she spoke, Susan was acutely aware of the other customers in the store. Mrs. Peterson had abandoned all pretense of shopping and was openly staring, her hand pressed to her mouth in shock. Mr. Johnson had lowered his newspaper, his rheumy eyes darting between Susan and the stranger, a frown deepening the wrinkles on his forehead. The stranger stood silently for a moment, his shoulders slumping slightly as the weight of Susan's words settled upon him. When he spoke again, his voice was soft, almost pleading. "Please, I don't want any trouble. I'm just hungry and—" Susan cut him off, her patience wearing thin. "I've asked you nicely to leave. Don't make me call someone to remove you." The threat hung in the air, unspoken but clear. The stranger's eyes clouded with a mixture of hurt and resignation. He began to gather his meager groceries, his movements slow and deliberate, as if each one cost him great effort. As he turned to leave, Susan caught a glimpse of something metallic glinting at his neck. For a brief moment, she thought she saw a pair of dog tags disappear beneath the collar of his worn shirt. But she dismissed the thought almost as quickly as it had come. It was probably just some cheap jewelry, she told herself, the kind of thing a drifter might pick up at a pawn shop. The stranger paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. He turned back, his eyes meeting Susan's one last time. In that moment, she saw something in his gaze that made her heart skip a beat. Not anger or resentment, but a deep, abiding sorrow that seemed to reach out and touch her very soul. "I'm sorry to have bothered you," he said quietly, his words barely audible above the hum of the refrigerators and the ticking of the clock. "God bless you, ma'am." With that, he was gone, the bell above the door chiming softly as it closed behind him. Susan stood rooted to the spot, a strange feeling of unease settling in the pit of her stomach. She had done the right thing, hadn't she? Protected her store, her customers, her town from a potential threat. But as she looked around at the faces of her regulars, she didn't see the approval she had expected. Mrs. Peterson's eyes were wide with shock, a hint of disapproval in the set of her mouth. Mr. Johnson shook his head slowly, muttering something under his breath that Susan couldn't quite catch. The atmosphere in the store had changed, the usual warmth and camaraderie replaced by a chill that had nothing to do with the autumn weather outside. Susan found herself wishing she could take back her words, rewind the last few minutes, and handle the situation differently. But it was too late. What was done, was done. As she moved mechanically back behind the counter, Susan tried to shake off the feeling of discomfort that had settled over her. She had always prided herself on being a good judge of character, on knowing what was best for her store and her community. But now, for the first time in years, as he reached the edge of town, the stranger paused, looking back at the cluster of buildings that made up the heart of Maple Grove. His eyes lingered on the general store, its windows now dark as the sun began to set. For a moment, he allowed himself to remember a different time, when those same windows had been bright with welcome, when the smell of fresh bread and coffee had been a comfort rather than a reminder of what he had lost. With a heavy sigh, he turned away, his footsteps carrying him towards the outskirts of town where a small, humble house awaited him. It wasn't much, but it was all he had left of the life he had once known. As the lights of Maple Grove faded behind him, the stranger allowed himself a small, sad smile. Tomorrow would be another day, another chance to find the belonging he so desperately sought. Back in the store, Susan began the process of closing up for the night, her movements automatic after years of routine. But as she turned the key in the lock and looked out at the darkening street, she couldn't shake the feeling that something fundamental had changed. The comfortable certainty that had been her constant companion for so long had been shaken, replaced by a nagging doubt that whispered of mistakes made and opportunities lost. As she made her way home, Susan found herself glancing over her shoulder, half expecting to see the stranger's silhouette against the twilight sky. But the streets were empty, the only movement the dance of fallen leaves in the cool evening breeze. Maple Grove settled into its nightly quiet, unaware that the events of the day had set in motion a chain of revelations that would soon challenge the very foundations of the town's self-image. The stage was set for a reckoning, not just for Susan, but for the entire community. The truth about the stranger, when it finally came to light, would force Maple Grove to confront its prejudices and re-examine its values. But for now, as darkness fell and the first stars began to twinkle in the sky, the town slept on, blissfully unaware of the storm that was brewing on the horizon. The crisp autumn air bit at Tom's face as he stepped out of Susan's general store, the bell's cheerful chime a stark contrast to the heaviness in his heart. The warmth of the store, once inviting, now seemed to mock him as he stood on the threshold, the door closing behind him with a soft thud that felt like a final rejection. For a moment, Tom stood motionless on the sidewalk, his mind struggling to process what had just transpired. The bag of groceries he had intended to purchase felt like a phantom weight in his empty hands. He flexed his fingers, calloused and scarred from years of service, now aching with the cold and the sting of humiliation. As he began to walk away from the store, Tom's footsteps echoed hollowly on the pavement. The streets of Maple Grove, once so familiar and comforting, now seemed alien and hostile. Every storefront, every passing car, Every face that turned away as he approached served as a reminder that he no longer belonged in this place he had once called home. Tom's mind wandered back to a time when these same streets had been filled with cheers and applause. He remembered the day he had left for basic training, the entire town turning out to see him off. Flags had waved, hands had been shaken, and promises of a hero's welcome upon his return had been made with fervent sincerity. Those memories now felt like scenes from another life, viewed through a haze of time and disillusionment. As he reached the town square, Tom paused by the war memorial that stood at its center. His eyes traced the names engraved on the smooth granite surface, each one a testament to sacrifice and valor. Among them were names he knew, childhood friends, neighbors, even a few distant relatives. He had never imagined that his own homecoming would be so different from the honored return these fallen heroes had received. The sound of laughter drifted from a nearby cafe, and Tom turned to see a group of young people gathered around an outdoor table. Their carefree smiles and animated conversation struck a chord deep within him. Once, he had been like them, young, full of hope, with a bright future stretching out before him. Now, he felt like a ghost, invisible and disconnected from the vibrant life unfolding around him. As Tom continued his slow journey towards the outskirts of town, each step seemed to carry him further away from the life he had once known. The weight of his experiences, the battles fought, the comrades lost, the scars both visible and hidden, pressed down on him with renewed force. He had returned to Maple Grove seeking solace, hoping to reconnect with the simplicity and warmth of small-town life. Instead, he found himself more alone than ever. The houses began to thin out as Tom reached the edge of town. The manicured lawns and well-maintained facades gave way to open fields and scattered farmhouses. In the distance, he could see the silhouette of his own modest home, a small, weathered structure that stood as a testament to both his family's history and his current solitude. As he approached the house, memories flooded back. He remembered summer days spent helping his father mend fences, winter evenings gathered around the fireplace listening to his mother's stories. The porch, now sagging slightly with age, had once been the stage for neighborhood gatherings and lazy Sunday afternoons. Now, it stood empty, a silent sentinel guarding the remnants of a life long past. Tom climbed the creaking steps and paused at the door, his hand resting on the worn brass knob. For a moment, he was tempted to turn around. He didn't bother turning on the lights. The fading afternoon sun, filtering through dusty windows, provided just enough illumination for him to make his way to the kitchen. Opening a cupboard, Tom's eyes fell on a half-empty bottle of whiskey. For a moment, his hand hovered over it, the temptation to dull his pain with alcohol almost overwhelming. But he pulled back, clenching his fist at his side. He had fought too hard to overcome that particular demon. He wouldn't let one bad day undo years of struggle. Instead, he filled a glass with water from the tap and sat heavily at the kitchen table. His gaze wandered to a framed photograph on the wall, a younger version of himself in full military dress, standing proud and tall beside his beaming parents. The contrast between that image and his current reality was stark and painful. As the shadows lengthened and evening began to settle over Maple Grove, Tom remained at the table, lost in thought. He wondered about the other veterans he had served with. Were they facing similar struggles? Had they found a way to bridge the gap between their military past and civilian present? Or were they, like him, adrift in a world that seemed to have no place for them? The sound of a car passing on the nearby road jolted Tom from his reverie. For a brief moment, he entertained the hope that it might be someone coming to check on him, a neighbor, perhaps, or even Susan, having reconsidered her harsh words. But the vehicle continued on, its engine noise fading into the distance, leaving Tom alone with his thoughts once more. As night fell, Tom finally roused himself from the table. He moved to the living room, settling into an old armchair that had been his father's favorite spot. From a drawer in the side table, he pulled out a small, worn notebook. Its pages were filled with names, dates, and brief notations, a personal memorial to the men and women he had served with, those who had made it home and those who hadn't. Running his finger down the list of names, Tom paused at one in particular, David Larson. Dave had been more than just a fellow soldier. He had been Tom's best friend, the brother he never had. They had made grand plans for after their service, dreams of starting a business together, of building a life in Maple Grove. But Dave hadn't made it home. His life cut short by an IED on a dusty road halfway around the world. A single tear escaped Tom's eye, tracing a path down his weathered cheek. He wondered what Dave would think of him now, rejected and alone in the very town they had once dreamed of coming home to. Would he be disappointed? Or would he understand the invisible wounds that Tom carried, the weight of survival that sometimes felt too heavy to bear? As the night deepened, Tom's thoughts turned to the future. He had come back to Maple Grove hoping to find peace, to reconnect with his roots and maybe, just maybe, find a sense of belonging. But after today's experience at the store, he wondered if that dream was nothing more than a foolish fantasy. Part of him wanted to pack up and leave, to hit the road, and never look back. But a smaller, more persistent voice reminded him of the promises he had made, to himself, to his fallen comrades, to the memory of his parents. He had never been a quitter, not in the face of enemy fire, and not in the long, lonely nights that followed his return home. As exhaustion finally overtook him, Tom drifted off to sleep in the armchair, the notebook still clutched in his hand. His dreams were a jumbled mix of past and present, battlefield chaos blending with the quiet streets of Maple Grove, the faces of his comrades merging with those of the townspeople who had turned away from him. In the darkest hours of the night, a soft rain began to fall, its gentle patter on the roof a soothing counterpoint to the turmoil in Tom's heart. The world outside continued to turn, oblivious to the pain and struggle within the small house on the edge of town. But even in sleep, a tiny spark of resilience flickered within Tom's spirit, a reminder that tomorrow was another day, another chance to find his place in a world that seemed to have forgotten him. As dawn broke over Maple Grove, painting the sky in hues of pink and gold, Tom stirred in his chair. The new day brought with it fresh challenges, but also the possibility of change. Unbeknownst to him, the wheels of fate were already in motion. The truth about his identity and his service was about to emerge, setting the stage for a reckoning that would shake the foundations of the small town and force its residents to confront their own prejudices and assumptions. For now, though, Tom rose slowly, his joints stiff from a night spent in the chair. He moved to the window, looking out at the town that had once been his whole world. Despite everything, a small part of him still hoped that somewhere in Maple Grove, there might be a place for him after all. With a deep breath, he prepared to face another day, unaware that soon, very soon, everything was about to change. The morning after Tom's humiliating experience at Susan's general store dawned crisp and clear, the kind of autumn day that usually brought a sense of joy and community to Maple Grove. But today, an undercurrent of unease ran through the town, like a discordant note in an otherwise harmonious melody. Nancy Wilkins, a sprightly octogenarian who had lived in Maple Grove her entire life, made her way down Main Street with purpose in her step. Her cane tapped a steady rhythm on the sidewalk, punctuating her determined progress toward Susan's store. Nancy had always been a fixture in the community, her sharp mind and even sharper tongue making her both respected and slightly feared by her neighbors. As she pushed open the door to the general store, the familiar chime of the bell was almost drowned out by the chatter of customers inside. Susan stood behind the counter, her usual pleasant smile in place as she rang up purchases and exchanged pleasantries. But to Nancy's keen eye, there was a tension in Susan's shoulders, a tightness around her eyes that spoke of inner turmoil. Nancy made her way to the counter, patiently waiting her turn as Mrs. Peterson finished her purchase. As the last customer moved away, Nancy stepped forward, her blue eyes sharp behind her wire-rimmed glasses. "Good morning, Susan," Nancy said, her voice carrying clearly through the store. "I think you and I need to have a little chat." Susan's smile faltered for a moment before she caught herself. "Of course, Nancy. What can I do for you today?" Nancy leaned on her cane, her gaze steady and unwavering. "I heard about what happened yesterday, with Tom Harper." The effect of Nancy's words was immediate and palpable. The low hum of conversation in the store died away, replaced by a tense silence. Susan's face paled, her hands gripping the edge of the counter. I'm not sure what you mean, Susan stammered, but the tremor in her voice betrayed her. Nancy's eyes narrowed. Don't play dumb with me, girl. I may be old, but my hearing's just fine. Half the town's talking about how you turned away a scruffy-looking stranger yesterday. Except he wasn't a stranger, was he? Susan swallowed hard, her composure cracking under Nancy's piercing gaze. Nancy, I was just trying to protect my customers, my business. You don't understand. No, Susan, Nancy interrupted, her voice sharp. It's you who doesn't understand. That man you turned away, that drifter you were so quick to judge, that was Tom Harper. A collective gasp went up from the other customers in the store. The name Tom Harper seemed to hang in the air, heavy with meaning and memory. Nancy continued, her voice softening slightly, but losing none of its intensity. Tom grew up here, just like you and me. His family's farm was just down the road. After high school, he enlisted, served our country for over 20 years. Susan's face had gone from pale to ashen. I had no idea. He looked so different. Nancy's expression was a mixture of sadness and disappointment. Of course he looked different. War changes a person, Susan. Not just on the outside, but deep down where it really counts. As Nancy spoke, memories began to surface among the older residents in the store. Mr. Johnson, who had been pretending to browse the magazine rack, stepped forward. I remember Tom, he said, his voice gruff with emotion. Used to help me with my garden every spring. Strong as an ox, that boy. Always had a smile for everyone. Mrs. Peterson nodded vigorously. And so polite. He'd shovel my walk every winter. Wouldn't take a penny for it. Said it was his duty as a neighbor. As more people chimed in with their recollections, Susan felt the weight of her actions pressing down on her. The man she had dismissed so callously was not just a veteran, but a hometown hero, someone who had given everything for his country and his community. Nancy watched the realization dawn on Susan's face. Tom was one of the most decorated soldiers this town has ever produced. Bronze Star, Purple Heart. He led a mission that saved his entire unit. And when he finally came home, looking for a little peace and understanding, this is how his hometown treated him. The silence that followed Nancy's words was deafening. Susan stood behind her counter, her face a mask of shock and shame. The other customers shifted uncomfortably, many avoiding eye contact, grappling with their own complicity in the town's treatment of Tom. Finally, Susan found her voice. I didn't know. How could I have known? He looks so broken. Nancy finished for her, her tone gentle but firm. That's what war does, Susan. It breaks people. And it's up to us, the ones they fought for, to help put them back together. As the full impact of the revelation settled over the store, a palpable sense of guilt and regret filled the air. Customers who had been silent witnesses to Tom's humiliation now looked at each other with dawning horror, realizing their own role in ostracizing a man who had sacrificed so much for them. Nancy straightened up. Her piece said. As she turned to leave, she paused, looking back at Susan. The question now, my dear, is what are you going to do about it? With that parting shot, Nancy made her way out of the store, leaving behind a stunned silence. As the door closed behind her, the chime of the bell seemed to break the spell. Suddenly, everyone was talking at once, voices raised in a cacophony of shock, guilt, and urgent plans for making amends. Susan stood rooted to the spot, her mind reeling. The face of the man she had turned away, Tom Harper, she corrected herself, swam before her eyes. She saw now what she had missed before, the dignity in his bearing, the quiet strength in his eyes, the untold stories etched in the lines of his face. As the day wore on and word spread through Maple Grove, the town found itself grappling with an uncomfortable truth. They had failed one of their own, had allowed prejudice and fear to blind them to the needs of a man who had given everything for his country. The revelation of Tom's identity wasn't just a shock, it was a mirror, held up to the community, forcing them to confront their own biases and shortcomings. In homes and businesses across Maple Grove, conversations turned to Tom Harper. Old photo albums were dusted off, yearbooks opened to faded pictures of a young, smiling Tom. Stories were shared, memories rekindled, and with each recollection, the enormity of their collective failure grew. As evening fell, a somber mood settled over the town. Lights burned late in many homes as people wrestled with their consciences. In her apartment above the store, Susan sat at her kitchen table, a cup of cold coffee forgotten before her. Her mind raced with thoughts of how to make things right, how to atone for the hurt she had caused. Unknown to the residents of Maple Grove, Tom Harper sat alone in his small house on the outskirts of town, unaware of the storm of emotions and regrets swirling through his old hometown. As he stared out at the darkening sky, he couldn't have imagined that tomorrow would bring a tide of change, challenging not just his perceptions of Maple Grove, but the town's very understanding of itself. The stage was set for a reckoning, a chance for healing, for redemption, and for a community to remember the true meaning of honor, sacrifice, and compassion. The revelation of Tom Harper's true identity spread through Maple Grove like wildfire, igniting a firestorm of emotions that threatened to consume the town's carefully cultivated image of itself. By nightfall, there wasn't a soul in Maple Grove who hadn't heard the story, each retelling adding layers of shock, guilt, and indignation to the narrative. The town square, usually a place of casual gatherings and leisurely strolls, became the epicenter of a community in crisis. Small groups huddled together, their voices low but intense as they grappled with the implications of what had happened. The statue of the town's founder, which had stood sentinel over generations of Maple Grove residents, seemed to look down with newfound disapproval at the people gathered below. At the Maple Leaf Diner, the usual clatter of dishes and hum of conversation was replaced by a tense atmosphere thick with remorse and self-recrimination. Marge, the longtime waitress who prided herself on knowing everyone's business, moved from table to table, her usual cheerful banter subdued as she overheard snippets of conversation. "I can't believe we didn't recognize him," muttered Bill Henderson, the high school football coach, stirring his coffee absently. Tom was the star quarterback of the E85 team, led us to the state championships. His wife, Linda, shook her head sadly. "War changes people, Bill. We should have looked beyond his appearance." At another table, Sarah Collins, the town librarian, was close to tears. "I remember Tom coming to the library every week as a boy. He loved adventure stories, always dreaming of seeing the world. And now he's seen too much, and we treated him like a stranger." The diner's owner, Joe, leaned against the counter, his usually jolly face creased with worry. "Folks, we've got to do something. We can't just let this slide. Tom Harper is a hero, and we treated him like dirt." As the evening wore on, the mood in Maple Grove shifted from shock to determination. People began to talk about making amends, about finding a way to right the wrong that had been done. Ideas were tossed around, everything from a formal apology from the town council to a parade in Tom's honor. Meanwhile, at the First Baptist Church, Reverend Michael Thompson called an emergency meeting of the congregation. The church basement, usually reserved for potluck dinners and bingo nights, was packed to capacity. The Reverend stood at the pulpit, his face grave as he addressed the assembled crowd. "My friends," he began, his voice resonating with emotion, "we have failed one of our own. We have forgotten the teachings of compassion and judgment that are the very foundation of our faith. Tom Harper served his country with honor, and in return, we offered him only suspicion and rejection." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. Mrs. Abernathy, the church organist, stood up, her voice quavering. "We must make this right, Reverend. Tom was an altar boy here. I taught him in Sunday school. How could we have forgotten him so completely?" As the meeting progressed, plans began to take shape. The church would spearhead a campaign to raise funds for veterans-like services. They would reach out to Tom, offer him support and assistance. But more than that, they would work to educate the community about the challenges faced by returning veterans. Across town, at the American Legion Hall, a similar scene was unfolding. Veterans of various ages and conflicts gathered, their faces somber as they discussed the treatment of one of their own. Commander Jack Riley, a Vietnam veteran, pounded his fist on the table. "This is unacceptable," he growled. "We take care of our own. We should have been there for Tom from the moment he returned home." The younger veterans, some still struggling with their own reintegration, nodded in agreement. They saw in Tom's story a reflection of their own fears and challenges. One of them, a recent returnee from Afghanistan, spoke up hesitantly. Maybe this is a wake-up call for all of us. Not just the town, but us veterans too. We need to do a better job of reaching out, of supporting each other." As night fell over Maple Grove, the town was a hive of activity. Lights burned late in homes and businesses as people made phone calls, sent emails, and formulated plans. The local newspaper editor, sensing the magnitude of the story, scrapped the front page and began working on a special edition dedicated to Tom Harper and the issues facing returning veterans. At the high school, Principal Donna Martinez convened an emergency meeting with her staff. "We need to turn this into a teachable moment," she insisted. "Our students should understand the sacrifices made by veterans and the challenges they face. I want assemblies, guest speakers, community service projects, the works." Even the children of Maple Grove were affected by the town's collective guilt. In bedrooms across town, piggy banks were emptied as kids decided to donate their savings to veteran causes. Young voices piped up at dinner tables, asking questions about war, service, and the true meaning of heroism. As midnight approached, Susan lay awake in her apartment above the general store, her mind racing. The enormity of her mistake weighed heavily on her. She had always prided herself on being the heart of the community, on knowing everyone and their stories. How had she failed so spectacularly with Tom? Determined to make amends, Susan got up and went to her desk. She began to write, pouring out her regret and shame onto the paper. It was more than just an apology. It was a pledge to do better, to be better. As she wrote, she formulated a plan. She would go to Tom personally, offer her deepest apologies, and do whatever it took to make things right. As the first light of dawn began to creep over the horizon, Maple Grove was a town transformed. The comfortable complacency that had defined it for so long had been shattered, replaced by a newfound awareness of the cost of prejudice and the value of compassion. The revelation of Tom Harper's identity had done more than just expose the town's treatment of one man. It had held up a mirror to the entire community, forcing them to confront uncomfortable truths about themselves. But in that confrontation lay the seeds of change, of growth, and of redemption. As the new day dawned, the people of Maple Grove prepared to face the consequences of their actions and to begin the hard work of making amends. They knew that apologizing to Tom was just the first step on a long journey of understanding and reconciliation. But for the first time in a long while, there was a sense of unity in the town, a shared purpose that transcended petty differences and social divisions. The story of Tom Harper and Maple Grove was far from over, but as the sun rose on a new day, there was hope that this painful episode could become the catalyst for positive change, transforming a momentary lapse into a lasting lesson in empathy, understanding, and the true meaning of community. The morning sun had barely crested the horizon when Susan McDonald stepped out of her apartment above the general store. The streets of Maple Grove were quiet, the town still slumbering in the early dawn light. But for Susan, sleep had been elusive. Her night filled with tossing and turning, haunted by the memory of Tom Harper's face and the weight of her own misjudgment. As she locked the door behind her, Susan clutched a wicker basket filled with an assortment of items from her store. Fresh bread, preserves, coffee, and other essentials. It wasn't much, she knew, but it was a start. A peace offering, a tangible representation of her remorse and her desire to make amends. The walk to the outskirts of town, where Tom's modest home stood, felt longer than Susan remembered. Each step was heavy with the burden of guilt and the anxiety of what lay ahead. The crisp autumn air nipped at her cheeks, but she barely noticed, her mind preoccupied with rehearsing what she would say when she came face to face with the man she had so grievously wronged. As Susan approached Tom's house, she felt her heart racing. The small, weathered structure stood silent in the early morning light, its peeling paint and overgrown yard a stark contrast to the well-maintained homes in town. For a moment, Susan hesitated at the gate, her courage faltering. What right did she have to intrude on Tom's solitude? Would her presence only cause him more pain? But the memory of Nancy's words, sharp with disappointment and rebuke, spurred her forward. Susan had always prided herself on being a pillar of the community, someone who looked out for her neighbors. It was time to live up to that ideal, no matter how difficult or uncomfortable it might be. With a deep breath, Susan pushed open the gate and made her way up the weed-choked path to the front door. Her knock, when it came, sounded unnaturally loud in the quiet morning air. For a long moment, there was no response, and Susan wondered if Tom was even home. But then, she heard the creak of floorboards and the slow approach of footsteps. The door opened, and there stood Tom Harper. In the harsh light of day, Susan was struck anew by the changes in him. The young, vibrant man she remembered from years ago was barely recognizable in the weathered face before her, but it was his eyes that caught and held her attention, deep pools of blue that spoke of experiences she could scarcely imagine. "Mrs. McDonald," Tom said, his voice neutral, betraying neither surprise nor anger at her unexpected appearance. Susan swallowed hard, fighting back the tears that threatened to spill. "Tom," she began, her voice barely above a whisper. I've come to apologize. What I did, how I treated you, it was unforgivable." Tom said nothing, his expression unreadable as he regarded her. The silence stretched between them, heavy with unspoken words and suppressed emotions. Unable to bear the quiet, Susan rushed on. "I brought you some things from the store. It's not much, I know, but I hoped." She trailed off, realizing how inadequate her gesture must seem in the face of what she had done. To her surprise, Tom's expression softened slightly. He stepped back, opening the door wider. "Why don't you come in, Mrs. McDonald? I think we have a lot to talk about." Grateful for the invitation, Susan stepped into Tom's home. The interior was sparse but neat, with a few pieces of well-worn furniture and walls adorned with faded photographs. As Tom led her to the small kitchen, Susan's eyes were drawn to a display case on a side table. Inside, she could see a collection of medals, silent testaments to Tom's service and sacrifice. In the kitchen, Tom gestured for Susan to sit at the small table while he put on a pot of coffee. The domesticity of the scene, the quiet hiss of the coffee maker, the morning light filtering through lace curtains, stood in stark contrast to the weight of the conversation that lay ahead. As Tom busied himself with mugs and spoons, Susan found her gaze drawn to his hands. They were strong, capable hands, marked with scars and calluses that spoke of a life of hard work and harder battles. She thought of how those same hands had once accepted medals for valor, and how, just days ago, they had reached out for a simple loaf of bread, only to be rejected. "I take my coffee black these days," Tom said, breaking the silence as he set a steaming mug in front of Susan. "But I remember you always liked a splash of cream and 2 sugars. Old habits die hard, I guess." Susan felt a lump form in her throat at this small kindness, this remembrance of shared history that she had so carelessly forgotten. "You have a good memory, Tom," she managed, her voice thick with emotion. Tom settled into the chair across from her, his own mug cradled between his palms. For a long moment, he said nothing, his gaze fixed on the swirling steam rising from his coffee. When he finally spoke, his voice was low and measured. "You know, Mrs. McDonald, when I first came back to Maple Grove, I thought I was coming home. I had this idea that everything would be the same, that I could just slip back into my old life like putting on a comfortable pair of shoes." He paused, a wry smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. Turns out, those shoes don't fit so well anymore. Susan felt tears pricking at her eyes. Tom, I can't begin to imagine what you've been through. What I did. It was inexcusable. I let my prejudices blind me to who you really are, to everything you've done for our country. Tom's eyes met hers, and Susan was struck by the depth of emotion she saw there. Not anger or resentment, but a profound sadness tinged with understanding. It's not just about me, Mrs. McDonald. What happened at your store? It's a symptom of a bigger problem. We send young men and women off to war, and when they come back changed, because how could they not be changed? We don't know how to deal with it. We look away, or worse, we judge them for not being the same people they were when they left. Susan nodded, her heart heavy with the truth of his words. You're right. I failed you. Not just at the store, but every day since you've been back. We should have reached out, should have tried to understand. Tom took a sip of his coffee, his gaze drifting to the window where the morning sun was now casting long shadows across the yard. Understanding isn't easy. Hell, half the time I don't understand myself. But it's the trying that matters. The willingness to look beyond the surface, to see the person underneath. Encouraged by his openness, Susan leaned forward slightly. Tom, I know it doesn't change what happened. But the whole town is in an uproar. Once people realized who you were, what you've done for our country, well, everyone wants to make things right. A flicker of something, amusement, skepticism, passed across Tom's face. Make things right, he repeated softly. And how do they propose to do that? Susan felt a flush of embarrassment creep up her neck. Well, there's talk of a parade or a ceremony to honor you. The church wants to start a fund for veterans, services. The school is planning assemblies to teach the kids about what our soldiers go through. Tom held up a hand, stopping her. Mrs. McDonald, Susan, I appreciate the sentiment. I really do. But I didn't serve for parades or ceremonies, and I certainly didn't come back looking for special treatment. He paused, seeming to gather his thoughts. What I wanted, what I still want, is just to be a part of this community again. To be seen as Tom Harper, not as a hero or a victim or a charity case, but as a neighbor, a friend. Susan felt a wave of understanding wash over her. In their eagerness to make amends, the town was once again failing to see Tom for who he truly was. They were replacing one set of assumptions with another, still not taking the time to really know the man behind the uniform. I understand, she said softly. And you're right. We've been so caught up in our own guilt that we haven't stopped to ask what you actually need. She reached across the table, hesitating for a moment before gently placing her hand on Tom's arm. So I'm asking now, Tom, what can we do? What do you need from us, from me, to feel at home here again? Tom was quiet for a long moment, his gaze fixed on Susan's hand resting on his arm. When he looked up, there was a glimmer of something in his eyes, not quite hope, but perhaps the precursor to it. Honestly, I need time and space and the chance to reintegrate on my own terms. He took a deep breath, as if steeling himself for what he was about to say. But I also need people who are willing to listen, not to war stories or tales of heroism, but to the everyday struggles, people who can see me as I am now, not as the boy who left or the soldier who came back. Susan nodded, feeling a sense of purpose settling over her. I can do that, Tom. We can do that. It won't be easy, and I'm sure we'll make mistakes along the way. But if you're willing to give me another chance, I promise we'll do better. As the morning light grew stronger, filling the small kitchen with warmth, Susan and Tom continued to talk. They spoke of the past, shared memories of a maple grove that seemed both familiar and impossibly distant. They talked about the present, the challenges Tom faced in civilian life, the ways in which the town had changed, and tentatively, hesitantly, they began to discuss the future. By the time Susan left, the sun was high in the sky, and she felt as though a weight had been lifted from her shoulders. The path ahead would not be easy, she knew. There would be setbacks and misunderstandings, moments of frustration on both sides, but as she walked back towards town, Susan felt a sense of hope that had been missing for far too long. She had come to Tom's house bearing guilt and a basket of groceries, seeking absolution. She left with something far more valuable, a newfound understanding of what it truly meant to be a community, and the beginnings of a friendship that promised to change not just her life, but the very fabric of Maple Grove itself. As Susan reached the town limits, she paused, looking back at Tom's house in the distance. She made a silent vow, to herself, to Tom, and to every veteran who might find their way to Maple Grove in the future. This was more than just making amends for one mistake. It was about creating a community that truly lived up to its ideals of compassion, understanding, and mutual support. With renewed purpose, Susan turned and walked into town, ready to begin the hard but necessary work of transformation, not just of Maple Grove, but of herself. The weeks following Susan's visit to Tom's house saw a gradual but profound change sweep through Maple Grove. The initial flurry of grand gestures and public declarations gave way to something quieter, more thoughtful, and ultimately more meaningful. True to her word, Susan became a bridge between Tom and the community. She shared what she had learned from their conversation, helping others understand that what Tom needed most wasn't fanfare or pity, but simple acceptance and the space to reintegrate on his own terms. The town's response, once they understood, was heartening. The proposed parade was quietly shelved, replaced by smaller, more personal acts of kindness and inclusion. Neighbors began to stop by Tom's house, not with grand apologies or offers of help, but with invitations to backyard barbecues, fishing trips, or just to share a cup of coffee. At the general store, Susan instituted a new policy. A simple sign appeared behind the counter. Veterans and active duty personnel, your service is our honor. Please let us know how we can serve you. It wasn't about discounts or special treatment, but about creating a space where those who had served felt truly welcome and understood. The local high school, under Principal Martinez's guidance, developed a new curriculum that went beyond mere facts and figures about wars. Students were encouraged to explore the complexities of service, the challenges of reintegration, and the ongoing needs of veterans in their community. Tom, along with other local veterans, was invited to speak to classes, sharing not war stories, but insights into the reality of military life and the transition back to civilian world. The changes weren't always smooth or easy. There were missteps and moments of awkwardness as the town learned to navigate this new terrain. But with each interaction, each conversation, the people of Maple Grove grew in their understanding and empathy. Tom, for his part, found himself slowly emerging from the isolation that had defined his life since returning home. It wasn't an overnight transformation. There were still days when the weight of his experiences felt overwhelming, when the gap between his military past and civilian present seemed unbridgeable. But bit by bit, he began to feel a sense of belonging that had eluded him for so long. One crisp Saturday morning, about 2 months after the incident at the store, Tom found himself standing in the town square. It was the day of the annual Maple Grove Fall Festival, an event he had avoided in previous years, feeling out of place among the cheerful crowds. But this year was different. As he stood there, taking in the sights and sounds of the festival, Tom felt a tap on his shoulder. He turned to find Susan standing there, a warm smile on her face. "I'm glad you came, Tom," Susan said, her voice warm with genuine pleasure. "The festival wouldn't be the same without you." Tom nodded, a small smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. "Feels good to be here," he admitted. Different, but good. As they walked together through the festival grounds, Tom was struck by the subtle but significant changes in how people interacted with him. There were no dramatic gestures or over-the-top shows of respect. Instead, he found himself greeted with simple nods of recognition, friendly waves, and easy conversations about everyday topics. At the pie judging contest, Mrs. Johnson, the perennial blue ribbon winner, actually asked for Tom's opinion on her latest creation. "You've traveled the world, Tom," she said, her eyes twinkling. "I bet you've tasted some exotic pies. How does my apple stack up?" Tom found himself laughing, really laughing, for the first time in what felt like years. Mrs. Johnson. I can honestly say, your pie could hold its own anywhere from Kabul to Kansas City. As the day wore on, Tom found himself relaxing into the rhythm of the festival. He helped set up chairs for the local school's choir performance, shared stories with some of the younger veterans at the American Legion booth, and even found himself roped into judging the kids' pumpkin carving contest. It was during this last activity that Tom noticed something that made his heart catch in his throat. Among the pumpkins carved with traditional jack-o'-lantern faces and spooky scenes, there was one that stood out. It was a simple design, a carved silhouette of a soldier standing at attention, with the words, "Thank you," etched beneath. The young artist, a freckle-faced girl of about 10, looked up at Tom nervously as he examined her work. "My grandpa was a soldier too," she said softly. "He said sometimes the best way to thank a veteran is just to make them feel at home." Tom felt a lump form in his throat. He knelt down to the girl's level, his voice rough with emotion. "Your grandpa sounds like a wise man," he said. "And this is beautiful. Thank you." As the sun began to set, casting a golden glow over the festival grounds, Mayor Thompson took to the small stage set up in the town square. The crowd quieted, expecting the usual closing remarks and thank yous. "Folks," the mayor began, his voice carrying across the square, "we've had a lot of fall festivals over the years, but I think this one might just be the most special yet." He paused, his eyes scanning the crowd until they landed on Tom. "This year, we're not just celebrating the changing of the seasons or the bounty of our harvests. We're celebrating something much more important, the true meaning of community." A murmur of agreement rippled through the crowd. The mayor continued, "We've learned some hard lessons recently about judgment, about the dangers of seeing only what's on the surface. But we've also learned about forgiveness, about the strength it takes to give second chances, both to others and to ourselves." As the mayor spoke, Tom felt a hand slip into his. He looked down to see Susan standing beside him, her eyes glistening with unshed tears. On his other side, he felt a gentle pat on his back. Mr. Johnson, the taciturn hardware store owner who had barely spoken 2 words to Tom before today. "So today," the mayor was saying, "I don't want to single anyone out or make grand gestures. Instead, I want us all to look around, see the faces of our neighbors, our friends, our fellow community members. Some of them we've known all our lives. Others are new to us, carrying experiences we might never fully understand. But they're all part of what makes Maple Grove special." As the speech concluded and the crowd began to disperse, Tom found himself surrounded by a small group of townspeople. There were no fanfares, no formal presentations. Instead, there was something far more valuable: genuine conversation, laughter, and a sense of belonging that Tom had thought was lost to him forever. Later that night, as Tom walked home under a canopy of stars, he reflected on the day. The weight he had carried for so long felt lighter somehow. The memories of war and loss were still there, would always be there. But they were balanced now by new memories of kindness, of acceptance, of a community that had learned to see beyond the surface. As he reached his front porch, Tom paused, looking back at the twinkling lights of the town in the distance. For the first time since he'd returned, Maple Grove truly felt like home. It wasn't perfect. There would still be challenges, misunderstandings, days when the past felt too heavy to bear. But he was no longer facing those challenges alone. Inside, Tom made his way to the small table where he kept his medals and mementos of his service. Among them now sat a new item, the pumpkin carving from the festival, carefully preserved. As he looked at it, Tom felt a sense of peace settle over him. It wasn't just a thank you for his past service, but a promise for the future. A future where he was not defined solely by his experiences as a soldier, but accepted and valued as a member of a community that had learned the true meaning of honor, compassion, and understanding. As he got ready for bed, Tom realized that today marked not just a personal victory, but a triumph for Maple Grove as a whole. The town had faced its prejudices, acknowledged its mistakes, and emerged stronger and more united. It was a reminder that true heroism isn't just found on the battlefield, but in the everyday acts of kindness, understanding, and growth that build and strengthen a community. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, new opportunities for Maple Grove to live up to its ideals. But tonight, as Tom drifted off to sleep, he did so with a heart full of hope and a newfound faith in the power of second chances, both given and received. The story of Tom and Maple Grove was far from over. In many ways, it was just beginning. But it was a story now filled with promise, a testament to the resilience of the human spirit and the transformative power of a community united in compassion and understanding. As the town slept, the stars twinkled overhead, silent witnesses to the change that had taken place. Maple Grove had always prided itself on being a close-knit community, but now it truly understood what that meant. In honoring Tom, they had rediscovered the best parts of themselves, setting the stage for a future where every member of the community, veteran or civilian, old-timer or newcomer, could find acceptance, support, and a true sense of home.
Disclaimer: this channel does not support or tolerate any form of discrimination, racism, prejudice, or violation of human rights. The stories presented here are original and created by the author with the aim of promoting reflection, awareness, and dialogue. All content is developed with respect for diversity and the dignity of all people.